So hello and welcome everyone to today's International Transport Forum Ask the Author session. Today we're focusing on our latest report on urban logistics hubs. This is a very dynamic area that is subject to immense change at the moment because of the change in urban logistics dynamics, players, and content. This report is the fruit of an expert roundtable that was held around a year ago at the ITF, where we were able to analyze diverse voices in this field, correlate the results, and come up with recommendations for our policymakers. So I'm delighted to be joined today by our lead author and ITF policy analyst, Parnika Ray. Parnika will bring us through the issues, the findings, and the recommendations of the report in a very short format, in a 10-minute format, and then the floor is open to you to ask your questions. If you wish, you can already send us your questions using the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window. For those of us joining us on YouTube or on LinkedIn or other social media channels, use the registration link if you want to join us to ask us your questions, and we'll moderate and get through as many of those as possible. So without further ado, I will hand over to Parnika for the presentation and then look forward to taking your questions following that. Parnika, over to you.
Thank you, Ronan. I think because we have a very short time frame, so without further ado, I'll jump straight into the presentation. So it is a very short presentation, so I will cover only the key findings of the report. We'll start with what we did as a background and analysis and finish with the key recommendations. The report itself is much more extensive, so I do invite the audience to please read the report for a lot more additional details. The report outlines the complexity of urban logistics and associated hubs, as well as the variety of premises that underpin logistics. Now, these premises include transport and spatial requirements, real estate and labor costs, environmental and societal concerns, and so on. Now, recent trends in logistics, as well as growing regulatory demands, make urban logistics extremely complex. This complexity is driven by a vast range of activities resulting from various actors with different and often conflicting economic, social, and environmental needs and goals. The report explains why a greater recognition of logistics is needed in urban and transport planning to enable the shift to sustainable logistics. As we know, global freight emissions are expected to continue to grow, with road freight accounting for most of this growth. Additionally, traffic congestion, road crashes, air and noise pollution are all associated with urban road logistics. And therefore, there is a pressure on authorities to act. Now, given all these concerns, the shift to sustainable logistics is essential. What is the role of logistics hubs within this? In this context, hubs enable the shift to sustainable logistics by splitting urban and interurban traffic so that less vehicles or less polluting vehicles circulate in urban areas. Now, urban logistics are a fundamental part of city life. Deliveries, collections, servicing in urban areas generate all kinds of freight trips by trucks, vans, cargo bikes, and other modes of transport. Supermarkets, restaurants, retail shops, construction companies, and individual consumers all rely on the distribution and the return of goods, the collection of waste, and other services to fulfill their various demands. As we can see in this diagram, logistics flows operate at different scales. They interact with various actors and processes, from global supply chains to local distribution networks. Now, logistics hubs are spaces where crucial logistics functions are carried out in the last leg of the supply chain. These functions include consolidation or deconsolidation of shipments, storage of goods, sorting, and facilitating the shift from larger to smaller vehicles, including some low or zero emission vehicles. And these flows, they also include reverse logistics and waste collection. Now, typically when we think about logistics, we think of e-commerce. But what we show in the report is that urban logistics is much more than that. It includes deliveries, distributions, collections, returns, etc. Now, thinking about improving logistics started in e-commerce, but now it drives developments in other sectors. Next, the type of hub also varies depending on the logistics function that it supports. So for example, a hub can be quite small. It can be a 100 square meter dark store or a fast delivery station, or a very large 200,000 meter square large distribution center. And in dense cities, we find that large hubs can be vertical high-rise buildings, or they can be underground. They're not always necessarily horizontally spread out. And the traffic generated by these hubs are also different depending on the sector and needs to be analyzed accordingly. Now, in the context of sparse urban space, logistics hubs may not always represent the most economically or socially beneficial use of urban real estate. In dense cities, there are several competing needs, such as the need for affordable housing or commercial space. However, what we say is that in the absence of logistics hubs in urban areas could lead to more vehicles or more polluting vehicles due to the lack of transshipment facilities. Our findings show that there is a dual trend of logistics returning to the city, but there's also a growing demand for larger suburban warehouses. And in cities, hubs are more than just urban warehouses. They increasingly provide additional facilities, such as electric charging stations, rest areas for logistics workers, or other mixed-use functions. Ideally, hubs should complement each other rather than compete for space. There are also different types of hubs that serve the different sectors, as I've already said. The new formats and trends that we see emerging recently, and we've analyzed these in the report with examples. So, for example, there are underground hubs or multi-story hub facilities or mixed-use developments that include logistics. An urban logistics hub also does not always have to be a permanent structure. A temporary micro-hub that can be quickly deployed, moved, or reconverted, supporting the dynamic component of logistics demand is increasingly desirable. So what we see is that vacant parking lots or daytime empty bus depots in cities are also being used for transshipment from larger to smaller and more sustainable modes of transport, like cargo bikes or walking couriers. Hubs are adopting environmentally friendly and energy efficient design strategies, which are indeed crucial. So this is just a couple of quick examples from the report. At the left-hand side, we see this trend of transshipment that is now happening on an ad hoc basis on curb space, where parcels move from large trucks to last mile providers using pedestrian spaces. Now, these activities also generate some challenges and debates around the use of public space. City authorities are regulating to manage these activities to reduce the disruptions or impact on public space. We also see another example on the other side. It's a dark store that's included in a mixed-use building. Now, given all of this complexity, what is the role of policymakers? We have 6 recommendations, and I will go through that in the next slides. So first, sustainable logistics really depends on government expertise at all levels. Authorities have to understand the different hub typologies, their relationships with global supply chains and logistics movements in urban areas. Planning authorities must provide best practice guidelines and frame policies for logistics without significantly increasing costs for operators and customers. So there is a need to create dedicated freight teams to guide the logistics sector, and the focus of logistics should be at the forefront of political mandates and public debates. We recommend that the public sector should govern, while the private sector should lead the construction, operation, and management of hubs where they have the expertise. And given the diversity of the stakeholders and their interests, collaboration is really critical to the success and sustainability of logistics hubs. Governments, again, at all levels must play a role in facilitating and regulating private initiatives in logistics. And there's also another slightly different aspect where collaboration is important to harmonize regulations across cities and regions to really help the logistics sector, like the industry players, to navigate these regulatory complexities. There will always be some context-specific differences in regulations. However, national governments can facilitate the standardization across urban areas to help industry players. National governments also should mandate lower levels of government to consider urban logistics within their urban and transport planning frameworks. Urban logistics is both a traffic and a spatial issue, and therefore they must be coordinated. And freight transport should be more prominent in urban land use and related planning procedures. The supply chains are regional, national, and global, so hubs that are nodes in these supply chains require attention at all levels. What we also find is that the long-term horizons of real estate planning often clash with the dynamic nature of the logistics sector. So the capacity to swiftly deploy or move or reconvert logistics hubs is critical for sustainable planning. Now, there are examples in the report, like for the city of Paris allows a 12-year lease to private developers to develop logistics hubs on public land. But these hubs must be built in such a way that they can be dismantled at the end of the lease period if the lease is not renewed. So authorities, they need adaptive policies that balance operational requirements of logistics facilities with community interests, like livability, fewer emissions, lower pollution, or providing facilities to the community like EV charging stations. So in essence, long-term planning for logistics needs to be there, even though it may be complicated by the changing nature of the industry. Next, of course, very important is data. All levels of government really need better tools for data and for modeling, and also for analysis and generating these discussions on logistics. Universities need to be better connected with governments to facilitate research and data analysis. Currently, a lot of existing data on urban logistics actually remains scattered across research organizations and amongst various public authorities. These need to be connected. That said, there are privacy concerns from the industry side, which pose significant challenges also to collecting and disseminating data for spatial and transport planning for logistics. However, what we say is that policymakers must establish guidelines so that there can be better use of existing publicly available data while ensuring new data, necessary new data, such as on light electric vehicles or cargo bikes, is collected. And simultaneously, concerns around data security or interoperability among various systems must be addressed. And the last slide, and I will end here to go quickly to the quick Q&A, is that urban space remains increasingly scarce. Logistics competes with various other stakeholders. Increasing real estate values, varying vacancy rates, and limited industrial land in urban locations are a concern for public authorities and logistics players. So one solution is that authorities can enable the development of mixed-use buildings, which include logistics. And dedicated logistics hubs should also provide various other services to city inhabitants, like repair facilities, charging stations, rest areas, etc. Because the bottom line is that urban logistics hubs should provide added value to the neighborhoods where they're located than simply handling of freight. I will end the presentation with this. This is just a quick summary of a lot more that is in the report, but let's end here, and I'll hand over to Ronan for a Q&A where we can get into some more details. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much, Parnika. That was a very succinct synopsis of what is a very complex issue, of course, and a very detailed report. I'll pop in the chat a link to more resources there from the actual roundtable that happened about a year ago, in June 2023, I believe, where you can find more detailed presentations as well as video recordings of some of those presentations made to the expert audience. So please have a look at those resources. We're now ready to take your questions. Please use the Q&A function to send your questions to Parnika. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible. Already there's a pre-question set up, Parnika, which is talking about the real estate question on which you touched. So with the dual trends of a logistics sprawl as well as logistics returning to the center of cities, what is the implication for real estate and land use planning?
Yeah, there's an entire section in the report which talks about this, so I'll try to give a very short answer if possible. So what we found is that urban and suburban logistics real estate is influenced by various factors. There's rent, there's land availability, transport costs, and evolving consumer needs. So this leads to dual outcomes like logistics sprawl, but also logistics returning to the city. According to market analysis, what we find is that the site selection for logistics spaces is a calculation between land and property costs, transport and labor costs, all relative to rent levels and delivery times. Zoning codes and regulations also have an impact. And in cities, because there is rising rents and there is competition from other sectors like housing, there is an impact on urban logistics real estate. And in some cases, this drives certain segments of logistics outside of the city to suburban or peri-urban areas where there is more land, industrial land available or cheaper land available for large warehousing. But there are other sectors like retailers or e-commerce or these 15-minute fast delivery businesses that need spaces closer to consumers. And there's increased competition amongst them to move back to the city. And this is where we see the dual trend. And one last point is that transport accounts for like roughly 50% of supply chain costs, whereas real estate rent and labor costs are like 25 to 35% of the costs. So there is a trade-off. If you're located far outside, there is more transport costs. If you're located in the city, maybe higher rents, but lower transport costs. In terms of what government or policymakers can do is that there is a trade-off in this equation, and without government intervention, the trade-off will always be based on economics. However, there are other concerns. There's livability or other societal concerns that must be taken into account. And this is where government intervention is required. So that, there is the solution includes positive environmental and social impacts as well. And I'll stop there. Hope that kind of covers this question.
It's a very clear answer. Thank you very much, Parnika. Let's take a question from Antoine Rubichet, because it's on the same topic. Antoine wonders, are there countries today that can be identified as models for good urban logistics? And Antoine mentions in terms of public policy or logistics for real estate. And I guess also, Parnika, if you have good examples where the environmental aspect has been taken into account and policies have been effective, please let us know.
Sure. Again, I would refer back to the report. What we had was several case studies from different cities and regions across the world to come and present. So we had City of Paris, London, Rotterdam. From an emerging markets perspective, we had Brazil and Vietnam. I wouldn't say there is a model, but there are different models depending on the context and the maturity of the market. We also had Japan, by the way, what's going on in Tokyo, which is a very advanced market for logistics. So each of them have certain, regulations in place that has improved the sustainability of logistics in that context. I gave the example of the 12-year lease in Paris, for example. In Tokyo, we see that there is a lot of cooperation between city-level governments and the national governments to define long-term logistics goals, to see how logistics land is released for these hubs, and so on and so forth. There's also example from London where there is a master plan around logistics. So it's called the London Logistics Plan for, I forget now, 2020 or 2021. Anyway, which has a series of policies that can be followed to enhance sustainable logistics. So there are several examples. Also from a real estate perspective, I think the London plan is quite an interesting one. It's found on it's there published on the Department for Transport website. The examples are there in the report. So I would invite the audience to look at all these different examples and see how different governments are using different types of policies to promote sustainable logistics.
Thanks, Parnika. Reminder to use the Q&A function, question and answer function for your questions. A question in from Thiago Arantes, who asks, what are the challenges in establishing an effective urban logistics system combined with regional logistics in cities where the delivery density does not allow for dedicated urban logistics infrastructures? So for example, where there are restrictions on the type of vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I have to go through that question again. That was a bit long.
Let's just repeat the question then for our viewers. So the question is, what are the types of challenges in establishing an effective urban logistics system combined with regional logistics in cities where delivery density doesn't allow for dedicated infrastructure? So I am guessing that this is urban areas that are lacking the required density to allow for the program that you're talking about for dedicated hubs.
So I think for this, I would say we analyzed mostly dense urban areas. You know, as I said, there was Rotterdam, Tokyo, London, Paris in our case studies. But we also had a few smaller cities because that is definitely an area that we looked at. You know, where smaller cities or in Europe, for example. So we reached out to several Belgian smaller cities, Mechelen and others, where we looked at, you know, what are these smaller cities doing? So what we found is that there are some specific examples. So in Leuven, for example, which is a small city in Belgium, it has a student population, etc. So the details are in the report. There is a digital platform that that the local authorities have established with traders, so that logistics, you know, so not just establishing a physical hub, but there can be a digital hub as well, which connects traders with consumers and tries to consolidate the shipment of parcels through this platform. So that is one way where if a physical hub infrastructure is not possible, can there be a digital hub infrastructure? And we've given an example of that. We also looked at some cities in Italy, where like Lucca or Padua, which were smaller compared to the other big cities, and there are urban consolidation centers that are there in collaboration between industry and the government. These are public-private partnerships, which also promote consolidation of shipments, among other things, which promote sustainable logistics. So I would invite the audience also to take a look at these examples that are there.
Thanks indeed, Parnika. A question in from Alex Genou-Prachex, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who asks about the articulation between different governmental levels in the terms of planning logistics. And Alex clarifies the question with the example of France, where the implication is that it's not quite clear which level, city, state, region, is actually taking those decisions and who is responsible for the delivery of this, unlike public transport, where it's very clear that at a city level, for example, it's the city authority, etc. Can you speak to that, Parnika?
Yeah, this is a very important and interesting question. So thank you for that, because we do touch upon this harmonization of regulations and also vertical and horizontal coordination between different levels of government. Yes, it's true that, you know, this is not always clear. And oftentimes we say cities are urban space managers or footprint managers. It's what we've written in the report. And they are often taking the lead, you know, in establishing certain guidelines. But again, like, these guidelines can vary between cities. And sometimes what we hear from the logistics industry side as well, that the timeline set by cities, for example, to transition to EVs may not be realistic for them because of different supply and demand variations. And again, the recommendation is definitely that all levels need to coordinate. I mean, there are silos, we can't deny that, but these silos, like, there has to be some coordination, there has to be some national level mandate, and that's what I said in one of the recommendations. National level has to support the harmonization of regulations. They must give mandates to lower levels of government, and then at the regional or metropolitan level, there has to be more coordination to establish, you know, comprehensive logistics plans, which are, let's say, aligned. There's an alignment between land use planning and traffic planning. I think some of that, as an example, is being done. So there are sustainable urban logistics plans, or SULPs, in the European Union, and cities are being encouraged to combine that with their sustainable urban mobility planning, or SUMPs. So these are some examples, but I do agree there has to be a more clear definition.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Parnika. A question from Carol Powell, who asks about what can promote the introduction of mixed-use logistics hubs. I am assuming mixed-use logistics hubs is what we're talking about when we talk about logistics hubs in that report. Maybe, Parnika, you can just expand on what mixed-use now means, given the changes in logistics.
Yes. So I think we've used several examples from Paris, city of Paris specifically. We invited this public-private developer called Sogaris to the roundtable, and they have been promoting this model. There is the example of the logistics hotel Chapelle International in Paris, which promotes this And there are other also sites which are developing similar concepts. So mixed use is basically when a facility is not just purely for logistics, but it includes other functions. They can be commercial spaces, office spaces, recreational spaces, or a gym, or even in the case, one example in Paris, there's urban farming on the terrace. So these are examples of mixed use urban logistics hubs. And the city of Paris has quite innovative regulations around that. Again, I won't get into too many details because that'll take up all the time. So I do invite readers to take a look at the examples from City of Paris where this is promoted, but it's not the only city. I know that it happens in London as well, and in other cities across the world. So there is a movement towards this. So it has, of course, its own constraints. Not every site can accommodate logistics because of various infrastructure, regulatory, and other concerns. And there's always some land use or zoning restrictions, but there are still examples within all these different constraints.
Thanks indeed, Parnika. We're just launching a quick poll, so you can let us know how interesting or not you find these sessions. There's still time for a few more questions. Don't hesitate to use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window. The next question is in from Nicola Cruz Gonzalez, who asks again about consolidation centers. What is their role to enable other sustainable modes, for example, shared trucks and coordination amongst private companies? Does the report delve into that, Parnika?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen is, again, like this is it's a very interesting, but also a tricky area, which we've covered in the report. So when we talk about consolidation centers, I think what we've said is that, urban consolidation centers, if they depend, for example, on public subsidies, oftentimes we've done the research, we see that they don't work out in the long term once subsidies are lifted. However, shared infrastructure can be a solution. I think was the question on, sorry, could you just repeat that again, please, for 1 second, because I think I missed the second half of that question.
The question was asking about the role of consolidation centers that would enable other sustainable urban freight, like shared trucks, for example.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there is, okay, yeah. In terms of like what we found that oftentimes shared infrastructure, like there could be a logistics hub which is used by different logistics players. There are examples to that. The space is shared, infrastructure is shared. If there's EV charging, that is shared. But the actual shipment of sharing trucks or consolidating with trucks, that again depends on how flexible the private sector is or the logistics sector is. That said, there are regulations in place. So, for example, if there are certain urban vehicle access restrictions or certain types of, time restrictions for deliveries, or certain areas where delivery vehicles cannot circulate, these are regulations cities are developing. This oftentimes, in a way, nudges industry in the right direction to consolidate, to share trucks or to share other infrastructure to make operations efficient. But as such, I would say UCCs in general, if they depend on public subsidies, they don't work. They haven't. The examples, empirical evidence shows they don't work, and especially when subsidies are lifted. So there has to be some other kind of long-term planning around how to nudge industry in the right direction to share or to consolidate shipment. I would point to urban vehicle access restrictions or other incentives.
Okay, thanks indeed, Parnika. Still time for a few more questions, I think, so don't hesitate. Quite a different question from Sten Vandal, who asks, it's more about the street space issue of urban deliveries, and how does the report consider the use of underground street space? And Sten points out that before there used to be underground pneumatic pipes sending mail around almost 44 cities, etc. I don't know if this is within the scope of that report. I may indicate that the space freight race is the place to go. Yes. But Parnika, do you want to answer that question also?
Yeah, I think I would say that we are not. I mean, of course, we have a kind of a limited, scope for the report, just to make sure that we cover everything in depth rather than superficially a lot of different things. So we've not particularly looked at automatic vacuum waste removal systems or underground pipes or pneumatic pipes and things like that. But indeed, I think there are a certain, some space freight races. One, I think there is the last meter delivery report that is coming out of the ITF, which is looking at certain automated systems. So I would ask the audience to look at those reports for more specifics. I don't know from the top of my head if they have covered this, but we have not covered this in our report. I think you're muted. What I would,
post-COVID, yeah. I'm still not able to
yeah,
unmute myself. I'm sorry, everyone.
No problem.
As Parnika said, there are more specific reports coming out in this area because it's really a hot topic with policymakers and urban planners who we're working with. Do check out the report that's in the chat, which is about the space freight race, about how you can actually manage that curb area better. It doesn't specifically go into the underground pipe, but it deals with the same problematics that are around that.
And if I can add one more thing to that, is that what in our report, what we do cover is examples of underground spaces being used for as logistics hubs. So there's an example of a vacant parking lot that was an underground parking space in the center of Paris, and now that's been converted into a micro hub for logistics, for storage and delivery of e-commerce and things like that. So we've covered some underground aspects from that angle.
Okay, thanks, Parnika. Time for a few more questions. There's really a question that's close to my heart in from Fuensanta Martinez, which is about electric vehicle charging stations and their links with urban logistics hubs. So Fuensanta asks, how can cities effectively incorporate electric vehicle recharging stations within urban logistics hubs to streamline the transition to zero emission delivery schemes? And that's touched on in the report, is it not?
Yes, we've briefly touched on that. I mean, we've not gone into all the regulatory requirements for that, but we've definitely said that hubs of the future, they can't just be a place for the handling of freight and business as usual. They need to provide additional facilities to the neighborhood, and one of them is, of course, promoting, the use of electric vehicles in freight itself. And we see that a lot of freight vehicles are transitioning to electric or light electric vehicles. And some cities are even regulating that all electric vehicles, like there's an example from the Netherlands where there is a mandate that, that freight vehicles need to be electric by a certain amount of time. So hubs definitely need to provide this infrastructure for charging to facilitate this transition to low or zero emission vehicles. I mean, that said, there are also other regulatory concerns around that. How does that infrastructure get built? Who provides for that? If a hub is temporary, it's like you have to install that infrastructure, but then if the hub doesn't exist after a point of time because market dynamics have changed, how is that infrastructure going to be reused? Because there are long time horizons and the market is very dynamic. So it's just not a one-time thing. So I think those, variables need to be considered over a period of time, considering the nature of the industry. So yes, it's important, but many things have to be considered along the way.
Thanks, Parnika. This may also have answered the question from Anna Peso, who asks about the methodology behind the report. I think how much the hubs are modeled according to new energies and the use of intensive use of electric vehicles, H2V, etc. But I think, I guess that's pretty much covered, unless you want to talk about the methodology of that, Parnika.
Yeah, I think what we haven't done for this report, but what ITF does is this modeling of EV recharge requirements and things like that. So we haven't modeled, what is the use of new energy in a hub scenario, for example. If we moved to intensive EV use, what would be, the requirement? So that is not modeled for this particular report. But that said, ITF does model this, and this is something that we will look into in the ITF freight models and other reports, perhaps in the future, to be more specific. But I do know that there is research out there which discusses this at the moment. It's just that this was not within the scope of the report, so we didn't cover that extensively.
Okay, thank you. The one last question we'll take is on the use of e-commerce and parcel lockers that you've touched on within the report. Parcel lockers are often considered a way to reduce those last mile stops and delivery route is that a way to increase the sustainability of urban logistics?
Thanks for that last question. Yeah, we kind of we touch upon different scales from like the global, like large supply chains to the last mile and parcel lockers being one of the very, last endpoints of reaching the consumer. There are major advantages to parcel lockers in terms of their versatility, accessibility, and all the other reasons you've mentioned. But what we also found is that that parcel lockers are not a universally, sustainable alternative. So there's a study in the Netherlands that showed that if a trip to a parcel locker is more than 400 meters, for example, 10% of the customers take a car, and they may collectively emit more emissions than what the delivery vehicle saved. And this travel behavior is also seen in the US and in France in different studies. So what we are saying in the report is that less transport by one party may result in more transport by another party, depending, whether it's the provider or the consumer. And depending on the sustainability of the mode choice of both providers and consumers, the net effect can be positive or negative. So typically, studies focus on only one side, and this may give an incomplete picture. So what we encourage is that a complete analysis is required, taking both sides, and to understand what's the net benefit. But that said, there are opportunities associated with parcel lockers, and we believe that if they are located strategically and efficiently managed and integrated into the broader urban logistics framework, then their effectiveness will increase, and it will definitely contribute to sustainability.
Thank you very much indeed, Parnika. We'll wrap it up there because we have reached our time. We've had brilliant questions. Thank you so much. That was a very inspiring Ask the Author session. Thank you very much, Parnika, for an excellent report and a great presentation. As Parnika mentioned, there's more content in this area coming up. I popped in a link where you can subscribe to our publication alerts. We'll be at the ITS World Congress in Dubai in September, for which we will have 3 new reports, one of which is specifically looking at the last meter rather than the last kilometer. So the last link within urban logistics. So it should be quite an interesting report. And the usual links I'll just pop in the chat so you can stay in touch on our social media channels. Parnika Ray, thank you very much.
Thank you for the rapid fire round. Hopefully we've answered as many questions as we could.
Very good. When it shows that it's a hot topic and people are interested, it's good. And we will see you back soon in September for the next Ask the Author session. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.